A war veteran adopted an aggressive pit bull that everyone else rejected. When they got home, something extraordinary happened that changed their lives forever. Two wounded souls found healing in each other, transforming trauma into hope. A story that proves unconditional love has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Prepare to be moved. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. There was something different in the air that autumn afternoon. Dry leaves danced in the wind, creating a melancholic symphony that seemed to accompany John's heavy steps. The sky, tinged with a deep orange, announced the end of another day. But for him, every day ended the same way, empty and without purpose. 20 years serving in the armed forces, 3 international missions, countless stories he could never tell. All that remained was a small house on the outskirts of town, a mind filled with memories he wished he could forget, and a clinical diagnosis that explained, but didn't alleviate, severe PTSD. John walked aimlessly, as he did every afternoon, since returning home. It was his way of escaping the walls that seemed to suffocate his memories. That specific afternoon, however, his steps led him down a different path. At the end of a tree-lined street, a small, worn brick building housed the municipal animal shelter. He had never noticed the place before, or perhaps he had never allowed his eyes to truly see beyond the fog of his own pain. "Can I help you, sir?" The young employee's voice echoed through the entrance lobby, surprising John, who hadn't realized he was already inside the shelter. For a moment he wanted to turn back, return to the safe isolation of his routine. Something, however, kept him there. Just looking," he answered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Feel free. We have many animals waiting for a home. Some have been here so long we've lost hope of seeing them adopted." John nodded silently and began walking down the corridor leading to the kennels. Dogs of all sizes watched him, some wagging their tails with renewed hope, others already too disheartened to show any expectation when a human passed by. With each step, he felt a strange discomfort growing in his chest. Those eyes, in some way, seemed to mirror something he knew very well. At the end of the corridor, isolated from the others, a particularly secluded kennel caught his attention. Unlike the other compartments, this one was silent. No barking, no visible movement, just a red sign fixed to the grate. "Caution. Aggressive. Do not approach." John felt a shiver run down his spine when his eyes met the occupant of the kennel. A gray pit bull, with deep amber eyes that stared at him with a mixture of distrust and exhaustion. The animal didn't growl, didn't move, just held that penetrating gaze that seemed to say, "I've seen enough of this world to know there's nothing you can offer me. This is the only one we don't recommend for adoption." The employee appeared beside him, her voice now lower, almost a whisper. He was rescued from a terrible situation. His former owner used him in illegal dogfights. When we found him, he was barely alive, infected wounds, malnourished, with clear signs of severe abuse. Physically, he recovered, but the scars we don't see are the deepest, John finished without taking his eyes off the animal. Employee stared at him in surprise. "Exactly. We've tried everything, specialized trainers, medication, different approaches. He just doesn't trust anyone. He attacks anyone who tries to get closer than this grate. Unfortunately, after so many attempts, the shelter management is considering euthanasia as a last resort." "What's his name?" John asked, feeling a strange connection forming. "The staff call him Shadow because of his coloring and also because, well, he's like a shadow of what could have been a normal dog." John remained silent, observing Shadow. The animal lay down, in the farthest corner of the kennel, still keeping his eyes fixed on the stranger who didn't leave like all the others. There was something in that look that John recognized deeply. It wasn't simply fear or aggression. It was an existential weariness, the look of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and decided it wasn't worth trying again. "I'll adopt him." The words came out of his mouth before his brain even processed the thought. The shock on the employee's face would have been comical in other circumstances. "Sir, with all due respect, that's impossible. This animal is not suitable for adoption. He's unpredictable and potentially dangerous. We would need guarantees we simply cannot accept." Besides, our policy requires a prior evaluation of the adopter. And the environment. I have an isolated house with a fenced yard. I live alone, I have time and patience, and as for guarantees..." John hesitated for a moment, something he rarely did. "I understand what it is to live with memories that turn you into something others fear." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant barking of the other dogs. The employee studied John's marked face, noticing for the first time the small, almost imperceptible scars near his temple, the gaze that alternated between present and absent, the calloused hands that occasionally trembled. "Did you serve?" she asked, softening her tone. John just nodded, uncomfortable with the question but understanding her need to assess the situation. "I'll need to consult with management. We've never had a case like this. Normally there's no discussion at all when it comes to him." 3 hours and many forms later, John walked back home with an empty leash in his hand. Shadow traveled in a reinforced transport crate in the back seat of his car, sedated for the ride, a condition imposed by the shelter veterinarian who had still tried to dissuade him from the decision until the last moment. "You're making a mistake," were the doctor's final words as he handed over the crate. "This animal is beyond recovery." John didn't respond. He knew that sentence well. How many times had he heard similar words directed at himself? How many therapists and doctors had said, not in those exact words, but with pitying looks and resigned sighs, that his case was challenging, that maybe he needed to adjust his expectations about a normal life. The house that awaited him was a reflection of his current existence, functional, devoid of excess, organized with the military precision that had never left him. In the back of the yard, John had prepared a space for Shadow, a wooden doghouse, a temporary fenced area that would ensure safety as they adapted to each other, new bowls for food and water. Carefully, he placed the transport crate in the center of the living room and opened the door, immediately stepping back to a safe distance. The minutes passed slowly until the effects of the sedation began to wear off. John waited, patient as only someone accustomed to long vigils could be. Shadow's first movements were cautious. His snout appeared first, sniffing the unfamiliar air. Then slowly the gray body emerged from the crate. Upon noticing the human a few feet away, the animal immediately assumed a defensive posture. Hackles raised, teeth bared, a low, constant growl that made its message clear. "Keep your distance." "It's okay," John said, keeping his voice low and calm. "This is your space now. You decide when and how to use it." The initial days were an exercise in patience and mutual respect for space. John established a simple routine. He placed fresh food and water twice a day, always keeping his distance, always announcing his presence with soft words before entering the same environment as Shadow. The dog, in turn, remained constantly alert, taking refuge in the darkest corners of the house, accepting the food only when John wasn't looking. At night, the silence of the house was often broken by two types of disturbing sounds. Shadow's defensive growls when an external noise startled him, and John's muffled cries, fighting against nightmares that transported him back to the battlefield. Each suffered with their own ghosts, coexisting in the same space but still separated by invisible walls built by trauma. The change began to happen so subtly that, initially, John barely noticed. On a particularly difficult night, when the memories seemed more vivid than ever, he woke up gasping, his body drenched in sweat, his throat hoarse from screams he didn't remember uttering. The familiar feeling of disorientation enveloped him. Those first confused moments when he didn't know exactly where he was, when the safe bedroom of his house mixed with images of rubble and smoke. It was then that he noticed a warm, solid weight against his foot. Shadow was there, not touching his body directly, but close enough for John to feel his presence. The dog wasn't looking at him. He kept his head turned towards the door as if standing guard. There was no effusive approach, no typical display of canine affection, just that silent presence, that tacit recognition that they were both awake, in the dark fighting against memories neither of them had asked to carry. "You can't sleep either, can you?" John murmured, without trying to touch the animal, respecting the space that Shadow still clearly needed. In the following weeks, A new pattern began to establish itself. Shadow still kept his distance during the day, still growled when John made movements that were too sudden, still retreated when a hand extended towards him. But at night, when the nightmares struck, he would appear, sometimes at the foot of the bed, sometimes in the doorway, always vigilant, always present. The first time John managed to touch Shadow happened after a month of living together. A violent storm was raging, and the thunder made the house shake. For both of them, loud noises were powerful triggers. John, sitting on the living room floor, breathed deeply, trying to apply the techniques he had learned in therapy to control his anxiety. Shadow, curled up under the coffee table, was visibly trembling. On impulse, John began to speak, not to Shadow but about his own experiences. Words he had never shared with therapists or colleagues now flowed to an unlikely listener. "The noise is never just noise to me." His voice was almost a whisper. "Every boom takes me back there. I can smell the damp earth mixed with gunpowder. I can hear the screams. They say it passes with time, that the mind eventually separates past and present. Maybe for some, not for me." As he spoke, without realizing it, he had moved closer to the table. Shadow watched him, ears attentive, body still tense, but the eye's usual growl was absent. Slowly, very slowly, John extended his open hand, palm up, and left it motionless in the space between them. The world seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Seconds dragged on like hours. And then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow moved his snout a few inches forward, just enough to sniff the extended hand. He didn't touch it. He didn't allow himself to be touched. But that small decrease in distance represented a greater step forward than any words could express. "It's okay," John murmured. "We're not there anymore. We're here, just here and now." 2 months passed, and the cautious dance between man and animal gradually evolved. John renamed Shadow, giving him the name Warrior, not to glorify the battles they had both faced, but to honor the strength they showed by continuing to exist despite them. The routine now included short walks around the property. At first, Warrior remained tense throughout the walk, reacting aggressively to any movement beyond the perimeter he considered safe. With unwavering patience, John gradually expanded that territory, always respecting the animal's limits, always attentive to signs of discomfort. On one of these walks, something unexpected happened. A distant neighbor suddenly appeared from around a bend in the path. Before John could react, the man approached quickly, hand outstretched in greeting. The sudden movement was enough to trigger both their defenses. John felt his body stiffen, his breathing quicken, his senses go on high alert, while Warrior immediately assumed a defensive posture, placing himself between John and the stranger. The surprising thing wasn't the defensive reaction, but what happened next. Warrior didn't attack. He stood firm, vigilant, his eyes fixed on the stranger, but he restrained the impulse to lunge. John, sensing the tension in the dog's body, gently pulled the leash, stepping back a few paces. "Sorry, he's still adjusting," he explained to the confused neighbor, who fortunately had the good sense to back away. That night, for the first time, Warrior accepted a direct pet. Sitting on the living room couch, John cautiously extended his hand, and when he met no resistance, allowed his fingers to lightly touch the top of the animal's head. The contact lasted only a few seconds, but it represented a milestone that no specialist at the shelter had considered possible. "You knew you weren't going to hurt me," John murmured, his voice thick with contained emotion. "Just like I knew you weren't going to attack earlier today. We're learning to trust again, aren't we?" In the 3rd month, John made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable weeks before. He took Warrior to a veterinarian, not for health problems. Physically, the dog was in good shape, but for a behavioral evaluation and to discuss possibilities for both their futures. Dr. Smith was known for his work with traumatized animals. His office, unlike typical veterinary environments, had been adapted to minimize stress: soft lights, low ambient music, spacious areas without a feeling of confinement. Even so, John spent days preparing Warrior for the visit, gradually introducing elements that would be present. The smell of disinfectant on his collar, the touch of basic examination instruments, contact with a shorter leash. "It's impressive, the progress you've made," Dr. Smith commented after observing the interaction between the two, "especially considering the history the shelter shared with me." "He still has difficult moments," John explained while Warrior remained alert, but controlled by his side. "He still reacts poorly to certain situations, certain sounds, but we're learning together." "Have you considered formal training? I don't just mean basic obedience, but something more specific?" "What kind of training?" "There are programs for emotional support dogs, specifically developed for people with PTSD. From the way you interact and what you've described about how he reacts to your nighttime episodes, Warrior is already naturally taking on some of those functions." The veterinarian's suggestion opened a new perspective. In the following weeks, John initiated contact with a specialized organization that works specifically with war veterans. The proposed program was twofold: training for Warrior as an emotional support dog and simultaneously assisted therapy for John. "You heal each other," observed Sarah, the trainer who accompanied them, after a particularly productive session. "It's rare to see such a deep connection, especially stemming from two stories so marked by trauma." Formal training structured what was already naturally developing. Warrior learned to recognize early signs of anxiety in John. Subtle changes in breathing, muscle tension, changes in body odor that humans wouldn't perceive. He learned to respond with specific actions, pressing his body against John's legs during panic attacks, waking him during nightmares, guiding him to less stimulating spaces when his senses became overwhelmed. In turn, John also learned to read his companion better, identifying the specific triggers that still provoked reactions of fear or aggression. He developed techniques to gradually introduce new elements into Warrior's environment, always respecting his pace, always offering escape routes and control. 6 months after the adoption, something extraordinary happened. The local Veterans Center organized an awareness event, and John was invited to participate. Normally, he would have immediately refused. Crowds, unfamiliar spaces, and forced social interaction were exactly the kind of situations he avoided at all costs. This time, however, he considered the possibility. "What do you think?" he asked Warrior, who watched him attentively as he held the invitation. "Do you think we're ready to face the world out there?" The decision to attend was not taken lightly. In the weeks leading up to the event, John and Warrior visited the location several times during quiet hours, familiarizing themselves with the environment, creating positive associations with the space. They worked intensely with Sarah to prepare Warrior for the specific challenges they would encounter. Unknown people approaching, other animals, unexpected sounds. When the big day arrived, John felt the familiar tightness in his chest upon seeing the crowded parking lot. For a moment, he almost gave up. It was Warrior's solid presence by his side, equipped with his official emotional support dog vest, that gave him the strength to continue. The first few minutes were the most difficult. Curious eyes followed the unusual pair. The man with rigid posture, clearly uncomfortable, and the gray pit bull who, against all expectations, behaved with impressive dignity. Warrior, once considered beyond recovery, now walked calmly among people, constantly staying attentive to John, responding instantly to any sign of discomfort. "Is that really him? The dog from the municipal shelter?" John heard someone whisper as they passed. "The one they were going to put down for being too aggressive?" "It's amazing what love and understanding can do," another comment reached his ears. It wasn't just others who were surprised. John himself found himself marveling at the transformation, not just in Warrior, but in himself. 6 months before, it would have been unthinkable to be there, in the middle of a crowd, talking, even briefly, with strangers. Warrior's presence didn't eliminate his anxiety, but it made it manageable, allowing him to function despite it. A moment during the event would remain etched in John's memory forever. One of the coordinators approached, asking permission to ask a question. "Would it be possible to share a little of your story with those present? Many veterans here are still struggling to find ways to deal with trauma. What you've achieved, well, it could inspire others," The old John would have refused immediately. This new John, however, with Warrior firmly by his side, felt capable of considering the proposal. With a nod, he agreed. In front of a small group, John narrated in simple words the journey they had taken, the state they were both in at the beginning, the difficulties, the small advances, the inevitable setbacks, and finally the relationship of mutual trust they had developed. As he spoke, he noticed something extraordinary happening around him. Heads nodding in recognition, eyes, moist expressions that clearly said, "I understand exactly what you're describing." "The truth is, I didn't save Warrior," he concluded, his voice slightly trembling. "We saved each other. Maybe that's how healing really happens. Not when we try to overcome our traumas alone, but when we find someone who understands our pain without needing explanations." The impact of that simple testimony went far beyond what John could have predicted. In the following days, he received messages from other veterans who had been present, some asking for details about the support dog program, others simply thanking him for giving voice to feelings they themselves couldn't express. The municipal shelter also got in touch. Warrior's story had circulated, generating renewed interest in animals previously considered unadoptable. They invited John for a visit to see what his decision had triggered. Returning to the shelter was a surreal experience. The place hadn't changed. The same corridors, the same smell, the same sounds. But the look with which the staff greeted Warrior was completely different. "It's hard to believe it's the same dog," commented the director, watching in amazement. His Warrior remained calmly seated beside John, occasionally checking on him with an attentive gaze. "You achieved what we all considered impossible." "It wasn't just my merit," John responded. He was ready to trust again. He just needed someone who understood that his behavior wasn't gratuitous aggression, but fear. A fear I knew very well. The visit had a specific purpose. Inspired by the transformation in his own life, John had proposed a pilot project, a program that would connect war veterans with animals rescued from traumatic situations, especially those with a history of aggression who would normally have little chance of adoption. "The idea is to provide mutual benefit," he explained to the assembled team. "The animals get a second chance and a supportive home. The veterans gain a companion who not only offers emotional support, but also a purpose, something or someone who depends on them, who responds positively to their care." There was initial skepticism, understandable given the risks involved. Veterans with severe PTSD and traumatized animals seemed, at first glance, a potentially problematic combination. However, the living evidence of the success of this approach walked beside John, attentive to every change in his emotional state. "We would need constant professional supervision," pondered the shelter veterinarian. "Specialized trainers, psychological support for the veterans, regular evaluations of the animals. I've already initiated contact with the Veteran Center and the organization that trained us," John informed. "There's interest from all sides. What we need now is a location to start and animals suitable for the program." The project advanced more quickly than anyone could have predicted. In partnership with the municipal animal shelter, the Veteran Center, and the support dog training organization, the Wounded Souls pilot program was officially launched 3 months later, with 5 carefully selected veterans and 5 dogs, considered difficult cases. On the day of the official launch ceremony, John watched with a mixture of pride and disbelief what had begun with a simple, aimless walk that autumn afternoon. Warrior, by his side, displayed a confidence that had previously seemed impossible, interacting calmly with those present, demonstrating in practice the transformative potential of the project. "Did you plan this from the beginning?" asked Sarah, who now served as the main training coordinator for the program. "When you adopted Warrior, were you already thinking of something like this?" John smiled, gently stroking his companion's head. "Not even in my most optimistic dreams. That day I just needed to do something that made sense, something that wasn't just surviving one day after another." A year after that first meeting at the shelter, John and Warrior had established a new normal. The nightmares still occurred, though with less frequency and intensity. Warrior still reacted defensively to certain specific triggers, although he could now recover quickly with John's support. The scars, physical and emotional, remained, permanent marks of the battles they had faced. However, something fundamental had changed. Both their existences were no longer defined solely by trauma. The Wounded Souls program had grown, now with branches in 2 neighboring cities, offering a new perspective not just for the direct participants, but also gradually changing public perception about war veterans and problem animals. On a particularly pleasant spring afternoon, John sat on his porch, Warrior comfortably settled at his feet. Together they watched the sunset paint the sky with shades reminiscent of that first day. Intense orange mixed with deep purple. "You know what I learned from you?" John murmured, not expecting a response, just sharing his thoughts as had become his habit. "I learned that the most powerful stories of redemption emerge from the most unlikely places, that the most wounded souls often hold the greatest treasures of compassion." Warrior raised his head, those same amber eyes that once overflowed with distrust now meeting John's with a serenity that seemed impossible at the beginning of their journey. "You and I, my friend, are living proof that it's never too late to start over, that the labels others put on us, unrecoverable, problematic, lost cause, are limitations we can transcend when we find someone who truly sees us as we are, beyond the scars we carry." Night began to fall slowly upon them, the first stars appearing in the gradually darkening sky. In the comfortable silence they shared, there was a profound truth John had discovered through this improbable friendship. Healing rarely follows the paths we expect or plan. Sometimes it emerges at the most unexpected moment, in the most unlikely form, like a broken soldier finding redemption in the eyes of an animal no one else believed capable of loving again. The journey of John and Warrior continues, day after day, step by step, not as a story of instant miracles or magical transformations, but as a testament to the power of patience, mutual understanding, and the courage to trust again, even when all previous experiences advise otherwise. In a world where trauma and pain often build walls between beings, their story remains a powerful reminder. Sometimes the greatest act of bravery is not facing an external enemy, but rather opening oneself to the possibility of healing, even when it seems impossible. And sometimes the path to that healing passes through the recognition of our own vulnerability, reflected in the eyes of another being who shares our deepest pains. On that quiet night, under the stars that silently witnessed their continuous evolution, man and animal rested side by side, no longer prisoners of their pasts, but companions on a journey of redemption that would continue to inspire all those fortunate enough to cross their path. And so remains the most powerful message of this extraordinary story, that even in the darkest circumstances, when all hope seems lost, there is the possibility of a new dawn, that even the most deeply wounded souls can find paths to the light, especially when they find other souls who recognize their pain and offer not judgment, but understanding, not pity, but respect, not just tolerance, but genuine love. For in the end, perhaps this is the greatest truth John and Warrior discovered together, that the greatest healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from finding a present and a future that make it possible to carry it with dignity, purpose, and eventually, peace.